In this lecture, I'll focus on the basic concept of claim plus evidence. Other words for the same thing are main idea plus support. Whether you're writing a cover letter for a resume or a research paper, you are usually presenting an idea and then supporting that idea with evidence of some kind. In this lecture, I'll focus mainly on different kinds of evidence that writers can draw on in supporting the claims that they make. So let's look at this paragraph. What's the main idea? What's the evidence? What kind of evidence is it? Pause the video and take a minute to read the paragraph. The words "for example" indicate that the second sentence gives supporting information. That tells us that the main idea is in the first sentence. The amount of body fat that a person can lose in a short time is limited. So now let's look more closely at the evidence. It's the personal experience of one of the writer's friends. This kind of evidence is often called anecdotal evidence. While anecdotal evidence shouldn't be totally discarded, it does have a serious limitation, which is that it only gives the experience of a small number of people. In this case, one person. To base a generalization on the example of one person is to overgeneralize. A case study is a kind of research that gives detailed, systematic information about one person's experience. For example, Sigmund Freud supported many of his theories with observations of individual patients that he had treated. As with anecdotal evidence, though, a limitation of using case studies as evidence is that they only give the experience of a small number of people. So it makes sense to use case studies in conjunction with other kinds of evidence. This is a revised version of the paragraph we just looked at. Pause the video and take a minute to read it. What changes did you notice? The writer kept the anecdotal evidence, but placed it at the beginning as a way to introduce the topic and catch the reader's interest. Then she followed it up with some statistical information about weight loss and placed her claim at the end of the paragraph. The result is that the support for her claim is now much stronger. Using statistics is a common way to support a claim. However, statistics can be used in a misleading way. You'll explore this point in some of your human services classes, but I'll just give a quick example to illustrate. Funding for AIDS research is more than adequate. Last year, the government spent over $1.2 billion on AIDS research. $1.2 billion seems like a lot of money, of course, but it needs to be put in context. For example, how does this expenditure compare to previous years? How does it compare to research on other diseases? How does it compare to the total spent by the government on health-related research? Another common form of evidence is to cite an expert as the source of the information. Clearly, information about global warming will probably be more trustworthy if it comes from a scientist who has studied it than if it comes from your roommate, unless your roommate happens to be a scientist who has studied it. When you use information from a person in your writing, it's always a good idea to add a phrase after the person's name that gives that person's qualification for being a knowledgeable source. For example, you can write something like this: Jackie Baker Sennett, the professor who is teaching this course, said that the first test will be on Thursday. This leads to the point that when an appeal to authority is used, you need to decide if that authority is trustworthy or not. For example, let's say that the New York Times reported that the US government tried to block a resolution by the World Health Organization that said that breastfeeding is better than bottle feeding. When you tell a friend about the story, your friend says it isn't true. When you ask how he knows that, he says that the President of the US said that it was fake news. You're immediately put in the position of having to decide which authority to believe, the New York Times or the President of the U.S. The only way to decide is to look into the support that each one gives for their claim. Research studies are very commonly used as evidence for claims. In academic writing, of course, but also in newspaper reports and advertising. How many times have you heard the phrase, "Studies show that"? This is another topic that you will study in some of your human services classes, so I won't go into it in detail here. But there are questions that should be asked when you are presented with evidence in the form of a research study. For example, is there another study on the same topic that came to a different conclusion? If a study was done on rats but is being used to support a claim about people, can we be sure that the findings can accurately be applied in that way? Was the research sponsored by a company or group with a vested interest in getting certain results? This is a passage from a research paper about DHEA, which is a hormone that some people think might have potential to help people resist the aging process. Pause the video and read it and decide what kind of evidence the author used. The main kind of evidence is information from authorities. 1, physicians at the Mayo Clinic, and 2, the FDA. Interestingly, the information from the Mayo Clinic is based on a critique of the evidence from available research studies. The claim made in the Mayo Clinic health letter is that people shouldn't take DHEA as supplements, and the support for the claim is that information available from research studies is incomplete. Writers make claims and support them with evidence. As a reader, you need to identify each claim and assess the evidence that's given for it. In this lecture, we looked at some different kinds of evidence and discussed possible limitations of each one. In the next lecture, we'll practice putting writers' ideas into our own words. This is a good way to test your understanding of what a writer is saying.